projects that I worked on, continue to work on at the Guggenheim Museum. I think everyone here will be familiar with the Guggenheim Museum, an institution that was founded in 1937 as the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, that then became the Guggenheim Museum in 1959 in its current iteration on Fifth Avenue and 89th Street in Manhattan. I'm really sorry, I think one of the bulbs of the projector isn't working well, so we've got this flash of pink, but just pretend it doesn't exist. So this is the flagship institution on Fifth Avenue and 89th Street, designed by modernist architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And this is really the headquarters of the Guggenheim. This is an institution considered as one of the most preeminent institutions of modern and contemporary art in the world, and in fact the only institution that has a global footprint. So if we go back to the first slide, you'll notice that the Guggenheim exists in 5 different locations: in New York, in Bilbao, until recently also in Berlin. This is a space that recently just closed, as well as the big Guggenheim Palazzo in Venice, and an upcoming space, 40,000 square meter space in Abu Dhabi, in the Gulf, which is scheduled to open in 2017. So, what does it mean for an institution of modern and contemporary art to be a global institution? And to be a global institution, not just in terms of its real estate, but to be a global institution in the way it thinks. And this is a question that we have been working on 6 or 7 years at the Guggenheim with the director of the museum, as well as the trustees of the board and the curatorial staff. And we have about 20 or 25 really distinguished curators who form the curatorial department at the museum. And the question of what is a global institution, how does one think globally, how does one collaborate globally, how does one represent a global voice today in contemporary art, is an ongoing discussion that is of great importance and concern and interest to the Guggenheim Museum and all of its various patrons, trustees, and also audiences. So we'll come back to the question of global as we get through this presentation. And Shalini mentioned this term transnational, and transnationalism is a term that's very current in academia right now. There are various terms that are equivalent. You have a study called multiple modernities, modernities that have existed and continue to exist outside of the European and the American axis, which is the axis that has been canonized and studied and exhibited in the West. But of course, we know that there will continue to be many, many centers of production and cultural production and knowledge production all over the world. And some of the projects that we've attempted to do at the Guggenheim over the last 6 or 7 years are really looking at these various sites of modernity, whether it's in Damascus, Cairo, Shanghai, Beijing, Bombay, Delhi, Rio, Sao Paulo, that represent very important global histories and regional histories that have really been left out of the canon of mainstream international art or Western art. These are huge problems and challenges that, of course, 2 or 4 or 6 curators in a single institution can't tackle alone. But these are voices that are really defining the next phase of art history, critical thinking, and international curating. So the term transnational, like the term alternative histories or multiple modernities or simultaneous modernities, is a term that's really used not just to define contemporary artists who have a nomadic lifestyle, who source inspiration from various cities and books and travels, as well as lineages of art history, but also curators and institutions that are thinking about the connections amongst ideas and amongst nations and amongst cultures. So one can think of it as cross-cultural, one can think of it as transcultural, and one can also think of it as transnational. And this is a term that's really informing us now within the museum not just in terms of the kinds of exhibitions that we do and the publications that we produce, but also the kinds of artists that we want to support and the kinds of artworks that we're bringing into the museum's dominant collection. So the first project within the Asian Art Program that was initiated in 2006 is a retrospective by the Chinese contemporary artist Cai Guo Qiang, that some of you will know, who was born in China in 1957, but moved to Japan as a student in the 1980s, and then subsequently moved to New York in 1995, and has been living and working in New York for the last 18 years. And I'm terribly sorry about the thing. You're not going to be able to see these images in there. But anyway, try to pretend it doesn't exist. So these are very early works that Cai made. He's an artist who's very well known for using gunpowder and creating these very kind of visceral explosions directly on works on paper, as well as doing live performances using gunpowder at the cheap world's explosion events. So the retrospective really mapped 30 years of his production and his own. And we started with the early works and the gunpowder drawings, which are very well known. And then these wrapped 3 or 4 different rounds of the Guggenheim in New York. And then proceeded to show a number of video explosion events as video cycles for visitors coming into the retrospective, so that they could see the documentation of these live performances that he has conducted at various sites, both historical and cultural and natural around the world. And this is a very important part of his production even now, as I'm going to this. As well as making very, very monumental and ambitious site-specific installations. So this is a work called Inopportune Stage 1, which we borrowed from the Seattle Art Museum and then reconfigured as a site-specific installation, tumbling down the kind of central void of the Guggenheim Museum. So this is, a few views of what the retrospective felt like at the Guggenheim, and it was a tremendously successful exhibition. Not just critically, but also with the public. And we are, as public curators and institutional curators, very, very concerned and very, let's say, sensitized towards our roles and responsibilities towards the public. And this is an exhibition that was really enjoyed by not just adults, but also families and children who came in. And we had a lot of visitors who came to the museum that had never really felt comfortable coming into the institution before. Cai Guo Qiang is also an artist who is represented in the dominant collection of the Guggenheim. Many times we will seek inspiration from the collection and look at artists who are already in the collection and do exhibitions with them or retrospectives of their work. It's a way of committing to an artist long term. We know that we can't cover Asia in any sort of comprehensive way, and that's impossible for one museum to try to attempt. So we've been very particular in the kind of strategies that we've adopted, where we relate the collection to the exhibition, and we try to focus on particular artists, particular movements, particular styles, particular historical periods. We really study them in depth. And this is one of the strategies that defines the Guggenheim. It's a museum that's very dedicated to contemporary artists and to living artists, and it really is an enabler and a collaborator. So here's an example of a work by Sandhini that's in the dominant collection. He's also an artist who works outside of the white cube context. Along with the explosion events, he also works along with community outreach and education, and enjoys going into different cultures internationally, and has created his own set of museums around the world, which are very integrated into the local site and the local audience. The second project that we did was a special commission by the contemporary artist Anish Kapoor, who was born in 1954 in Bombay, but has been living and working in London since the mid-1970s. He moved to England to study at the Hornsey School of Art and Chelsea School of Art, and has been living and working there since then. And Anish Kapoor was an artist who we really wanted to engage with, and the Guggenheim didn't have any prior history of working with him. So we decided to do a very, very major commitment to his practice, and we commissioned him to make a work of art specifically for the Guggenheim's permanent collection. Working with a contemporary artist in this format allows us to follow their artistic journey and their practice over many, many years. And we gave him the specific kind of mandate of creating the works for the Deutsche Guggenheim, which was the space in Berlin that I mentioned to you, that just, it still exists, but it's now been taken over by Deutsche Bank. So the Guggenheim is no longer involved in programming that space. So these are the first maquettes that he created back in 2008, various proposals that he envisioned in the space. And then we finally chose this particular iteration, which is a kind of orb that exists in the middle of the gallery and fragments and splinters one's perception and understanding and access of the site itself. So it's a work of art that not only deals with sculpture, but also deals with phenomenology and architecture, and how the body moves through space. So here are some of the maquettes from the studio. Leaving the kind of safety of the studio and venturing out and collaborating with engineers and fabricators outside of the studio context. Next. So just a few views of memory in its second life, where it's just been fabricated, and that's the view of the installation finally at the Deutsche Guggenheim. And it was so monumental and so large that it prevented us from actually accessing the museum. So we got one view of vista of it when it came into the main exhibition hall. Then you would have to leave the building, come in and get a second view. And then when you came down the stairs into one of these antechambers, you got a view of the inside of memory. So this was a very interesting and very important piece for Kapoor, because not only was he working with a new material, experimenting with wood and steel that he had never worked with before, but it was also looking at the status of the object, and like I said, not just in terms of architecture and phenomenology and the body, but also the relationship to painting. Because if you came and stood directly in front of this aperture, it became completely flat. He had found a way of figuring out the precise depth of the interior of the sculpture to actually create this kind of perceptual plane where the opening of the sculpture actually looks like an anti-icon black painting. So these are the kinds of risks that artists take and museums take, because unless you are directly in the gallery, having this kind of physical, visceral relationship to the work of art, you don't quite know whether it's a successful attempt.